He's running for governor. His name's Jeff Johnson, and he's a Republican. Jeff, thanks for joining the podcast again.
Good morning. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
So, what kind of hours are you keeping these days, Jeff?
It's busy, but, this is how I wanted it to be. So it's been good. It usually starts around 6, and somebody drops me off at home around 9, 10, or 11 at night, and we start again the next day. So it's been crazy, but a lot of fun.
Okay. So talk about this is one of the things from my old campaign days that I still get a kick out of. How many cups of coffee a day?
I am not a coffee guy. I'm not a caffeine guy.
Interesting.
I survive on sugar, so.
Okay. Well, and that, it's funny because you and I know a lot of the same people, but, my colleague Dave Lee over at WCCO Radio is not a caffeine guy either.
Really?
And I've gone off and on, but when I've been off caffeine, I have noticed that it's the sugar that keeps me going. Yep. So what are your sugar vices there?
I think every town over 100 has a Dairy Queen in Minnesota. So that is a fairly regular stop for us, which isn't the healthiest dinner, but that tends to be the substitute frequently. But I'll grab whatever satisfies my sweet tooth when we're running around and don't have time to stop and eat.
Well, I hope you haven't been using your credit card too much. Just kidding.
No, I haven't.
Little data breach at Dairy Queen for those listeners who haven't been following the news out again this morning. Let's dive into where this race is. You got the endorsement from the Republican Party. You had a very competitive primary, and you obviously understood that, Governor Dayton was going to be a formidable foe as an incumbent DFLer in a state that, leans a little left. Where do you see the race internally? What's the spirit in the campaign? And do you think you're where you wanted to be? Are you a little ahead or a little behind of where you thought you'd be?
I think we're probably about where we thought we'd be. And if I had to guess where we are, we're somewhere in the 7 to 8 range, probably back. I think we've had 7 polls in the last month, and if you average them all out, I think we're 8.2 back or something like that. And the last one was a week ago. None of them came out after we'd been on TV for any length of time. I think the last 2 that came out we'd been on for 3 days or something like that. So most people probably hadn't seen our first ad. Our second ad came out yesterday. And we have absorbed close to $2 million in negative ads over the past couple months. So we actually thought early on that we'd be down by 14, 15 points, which would be consistent with post-Labor Day for Emmer and for Hatch behind Pawlenty 4 years before that, since Pawlenty had the name recognition. So being in the probably the mid to upper single digits, I'm good with that because we are finally running on all cylinders from a TV standpoint. We'll be solid as long as I keep raising money. We'll be solid all the way through Election Day. I think the debates, while not tons of people watch them, people do see them and talk about them with other people. I think they'll be positive for me. And there just seems to be, I would say maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks ago, all of a sudden a change in momentum. People started paying attention. And I believe if people pay attention, I'm going to win. If they don't, probably not.
It's interesting you say that because I don't know if it's been a week and a half or 2 weeks, but it's certainly been in the last week that I think people have started to engage. And there was a Wall Street Journal headline earlier this week that really kind of summed up where I've thought, all campaigns were, but certainly in Minnesota is American voters are excited about ... nothing. And, I think a lot of the spillover from Washington kind of affects people. One of the things that I, want to talk about, and we're going to play your latest ad here in a little bit, but one of the, there's a few issues that obviously Republicans are pretty fired up about this year. MNsure, the Senate office building, things like that.
Yep.
Other than those issues, what are the issues that you really want to work on or that people are stopping you on the street to talk about? Because I got to tell you, when I'm at a hockey rink or a soccer field, those are not the issues that people talk to me about. Because I think people are almost, exhausted from those issues.
Yeah, I think so too. People, I don't hear the Senate office building and some of those smaller issues that I think are good symbols of poor priorities that we bring up. I don't think people are in their everyday lives are talking about that. I do hear about health care a lot, though. That does come up on the football field for me with other parents. There's a real concern about that, whether you're in MNsure or not. But the other issues that are coming up frequently, this is maybe a little more so in greater Minnesota than in the Twin Cities, but people are really worried about jobs, and there's no question that comes up more often than anything else. And I think there's an understanding that we have become uncompetitive in Minnesota when it comes to job creation and encouraging entrepreneurs to start a little business here that might grow into something big. So that is a big deal to people. People in Minnesota are always worried about K-12 education,
yep.
And that will always be the case. And they have different concerns depending upon what part of the state you live in. But there's certainly a lot of talk about education and what we spend on it. And you hear both opinions on that, and whether we're competitive, whether we're demanding results. People talk about the achievement gap, especially here down in the Twin Cities. And then I hear a lot of talk about government just spending money wisely. I don't hear a lot of people yelling and screaming about taxes. Some do, but probably not as much as in past years. But I hear people saying a lot, I live in a high-tax state, so be it. But I wish government would actually spend my money wisely.
When you talk about education, there's been a few articles out about how you and Governor Dayton differ. Can you be precise about your governor, what you're going to focus on specifically in education?
The achievement gap will be at the top of the list. We've had one of the worst, if not the worst, achievement gaps in the country for 30 to 40 years in Minnesota, which is just, that's embarrassing, and it's wrong, and it's unconscionable, and we don't really do much about it. And I think both parties can take some blame for that. We've just never had a governor who is willing to say, I'm going to take this thing head on, because we can't be giving up on 12 to 15% of our kids that are in school districts or in schools that are just chronically failing them. So that is going to be at the top of my list, and I can give you a bunch of ideas on that. But then also teachers, I think. Here's a really fundamental difference between Governor Dayton and me. I believe that we should be giving our schools the power and the flexibility to hire and promote and reward and pay better the very best teachers. And any study you read, or almost any study you read, will say that the two things that best predict success for a kid in school are, number one, involved parents, and number two, great teachers. And I don't think there's a lot that government can do to force parents to be involved. They're going to make that decision themselves. We can remove barriers, but they're really going to make that decision. But there is so much that we can do at the state level to help our schools retain and reward and promote the very best teachers, and we're not doing that. In fact, I think Governor Dayton is actually preventing them from doing that, and the reason is his education policy is being set by a special interest, the teachers union, at least the leaders of the teachers union. And I'm not an anti-union guy. I grew up in a union household. I have represented unions as a lawyer, but I get so frustrated to see that our education policy, especially these last couple of years, has really been set by the union. And I'll give you a couple examples of that on the teacher issue. Number one is the last in, first out bill. That was a 10-year reform bill that was passed by a very broad bipartisan margin within both houses of the legislature a year or two ago. My DFL senator was chief author, and what it said was it sought to change the law. Right now, the law in Minnesota says that if a school has to lay off a teacher, the only thing they can look at is how long the teacher's been there. So last in, first out. The newest teacher goes, even if that teacher is a superstar. What the legislature passed, again, on a broad bipartisan basis, was let's change the law to be more like most other states, and let schools look at tenure along with other things like performance or something else. The governor vetoed that bill. There was no substantive reason to veto that bill. It simply happened because a special interest told him to. Another example would be Teach for America. You probably know about that, Blaise, and it's a national program that is loved by liberals and conservatives alike because it has great results. It trains students right out of college to go into inner city schools. They focus on inner city schools to make a difference in the lives of a lot of underserved kids, and they have really positive, measurable results. And I believe there was about $1 million allocation for that, again, on a bipartisan basis. And the governor vetoed it. And by the way, this governor doesn't veto spending. He loves spending money. But he vetoed that $1 million allocation. And again, there was no substantive reason for that other than a special interest told him to. So I think you're going to see a very fundamental difference in education focus. It will be on more flexibility for our schools with respect to how they reward and hire teachers, and probably even more broadly than that, more flexibility, fewer strings attached for schools, and also a real focus on allowing our schools to be more creative and innovative with respect to solving the achievement gap in certain parts of our state.
Let's go back to the achievement gap. It is one of those bipartisan things everybody cites that they want to work on. Excuse me. How much have you campaigned in, North Minneapolis or places outside that are really suffering from this? And what do you think the outrage is of either those parents or the community leaders there? Because it strikes me that, and I thought about this morning when I read the Star Tribune and Keith Ellison profile about him kind of knocking on doors and getting people out to vote in North Minneapolis, is that we all kind of get outraged about some of the things that happen in some of these poorer places, from the achievement gap to youth violence, etc. But I got to tell you, I don't go there and do work, and maybe I need to look at myself in the mirror. How do you look at yourself in the mirror as governor and say, no, I really, really need to engage there? What is it that you either have done that it says you'll do it again or do it there, or that you said, you've looked at yourself in the mirror and said, no, that's some place to spend some time?
Well, I have spent time on the campaign. Well, two ways. Number one, on the campaign trail. It's a big state, so we try to get somewhere different every single day. We were up on the range early this week. We were up in Moorhead a couple days ago. But I have spent time in both Minneapolis and St. Paul, and particularly trying to go to larger events of new immigrant communities to kind of figure out what it is that they're looking for. How can government serve them better? How can we make the programs that they are served by government work better? How can we make their schools work better? Because, frankly, I think a lot of those parents have better ideas than I do. So whether it was, we must have spent 6 hours at Somali Independence Day a couple months ago. I was at the Juneteenth Festival in North Minneapolis, which was interesting because that's an African American celebration that celebrates I think it's the end of slavery in Texas for whatever reason. But I was there. Al Franken was there, Tina Smith was there, Keith Ellison was there. I think every DFL representative and senator from Minneapolis was there, and I was there. And I think a few of those Democrats practically had a brain aneurysm because I was there. I clearly wasn't supposed to be there in their minds, and we spent several hours there. I think I talked to pretty much everybody who was there, and it got a lot of ideas. Am I going to get a ton of votes out of that? No. Am I going to, compete in North Minneapolis? I'm sure I'm not. But
if you do, Mark Dayton's in deep trouble.
Right.
That's breaking news here on the Daily Agenda.
Right. But can we do a little bit better? That is one of the goals. But also a goal is to just see what you can learn. And so I have spent time as a candidate, but I think probably more importantly than that, as a Hennepin County Commissioner, I'm in Minneapolis every single week. And obviously, even though I represent the western and northwestern areas of the county, a lot of our focus when it comes to county services is on Minneapolis, because there are needs there that we don't have in Plymouth, where I live. And so I have spent a lot of time working with some of those community organizations and community leaders not always agreeing with them, but trying to come up with different ideas to solve problems that match my philosophy. And some of them like the ideas and some of them don't. But I think I probably understand what's going on in Minneapolis, for example, better than maybe some other Republican candidates have in the past who've just never spent any time there because of my job the last 6 years.
We're with Jeff Johnson, Republican candidate for governor. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the ad Jeff released yesterday and kind of how this final month of the campaign is going to shape up. You're listening to Blois Olson on the Daily Agenda on the Tom Bernard Podcast Network. I'm Blois Olson here with Mark Cummins, president of the Minnesota Credit Union Network. Mark, everywhere I turn, it seems that I see a credit union. Can you talk about the connection credit unions have built within the community?
Blois credit unions are owned by members. Those members are your neighbors and friends. They are the coaches, PTO presidents, and small business owners.
What are some of the ways credit unions are connecting in communities in Minnesota?
Well, at Como Park High School and Owatonna High School, credit unions are engaging with students and teachers about financial stewardship. Whether it's teaching about credit, budgeting or savings, or even helping with college financing, Minnesota credit unions are a convenient local choice for Minnesotans.
That makes sense, Mark. People are looking for more choices. How do credit unions provide that?
Minnesotans like local. They want to know that any profits from credit unions go back to the members. The dollars stay in the community. Credit unions are owned by the members, and that ensures that their interests are local and community-based.
Thanks, Mark. For more information, visit minnesotacreditunions.org. Welcome back to the Daily Agenda. Next Tuesday, Mike doesn't qualify, I don't qualify, but if you're bald, you eat free at the Blue Plate restaurants. It is Bald and Free Day at the Lowry, at the Longfellow, at Highland Grill, at Edina Grill, at Three Squares in Maple Grove, at the Free House, or at Scoozy. Blue Plate will be accepting donations for Locks of Love, but this is a tradition at Blue Plate from owner David Burley, who's a little follically challenged, I guess those people say. But if you're bald, you eat free next Tuesday at the Blue Plate restaurants. And one of their new features that you could have this weekend or next week, pancakes a la pumpkin. Pumpkin pancakes for fall. Mike, I'm looking at you. I think there's a brunch in your future.
I think there is, too.
Make sure you let the Blue Plate folks know you heard it on the Daily Agenda. They've been great for this show, and we'll continue to make sure you know what's going on at all those Blue Plate restaurants. We're back with Republican candidate Jeff Johnson, and we're going to play an ad the Johnson campaign released yesterday that really shifts the tone of this race, and I want to talk to Jeff about it. Mike?
Unaware of bonuses for his failed Obamacare bureaucrats, not even knowing what's in the bills he signed. $500 million taxpayer dollars to the Wilfs after they committed civil fraud and racketeering.
I was not aware at all.
What is Mark Dayton aware of?
Minnesotans deserve an engaged governor who knows what's going on and what's in the bills he signs. I'll be a 24/7 leader who owns his decisions. The buck stops with me.
Jeff Johnson for governor.
Jeff, you and I have known each other a long time, and I know that Outside Money, Alliance for a Better Minnesota, have said some things about you that probably aren't necessarily always accurate, or the tone of their ads has been meant to define you in a certain way. You really came out of this primary with a very kind of positive tone, almost a very Minnesotan. We're going to just talk about this. This ad shifts that. Is that a new shift in strategy, or is that just the nature of this race now?
I think it's the nature of the race, and the competence engagement issue has been consistent for me throughout the campaign. Actually, I've been talking about the fact that this governor is just not engaged. He doesn't seem to know what's going on in his own administration, and not even in the bills that he signs. So that has been consistent. We haven't been up on TV with that message in a pretty hard-hitting way as this one is. So I mean, it's been the nature of the race on the other side since the day after the primary. We've actually have absorbed almost $2 million in really negative, and I would argue quite false ads, especially on the education, K-12 education issue, since the day after the primary, and really almost nothing from outside groups trying to define Mark Dayton in any certain way. I think there's been about $200,000 spent, so we've been outspent about 10-1 on that side, and this is an important message in the race, and I think it's a very valid message to point out the fact that I think one thing that Minnesotans really value is a very engaged and involved governor who knows what's going on and is constantly involved in policy rather than essentially letting others figure out what should happen, or maybe relying upon others, and in the case of Governor Dayton, often when something goes wrong, blaming others. And we are very different that way. We're going to have a very different style about governing.
There's two words you use consistently there, engaged and competent. Let's talk about engaged first. While this governor has not, maybe, he's talked about either not reading a bill or things like that. I think if you ask Governor Pawlenty, you ask Governor Carlson, you ask, they've always said they haven't read every word of every bill, but they rely on staff. Do you think there's staff issues in the current governor's office?
I don't know if there's staff issues, but the bottom line is the governor is responsible, and I suspect most governors don't read every line of the 180-page tax bill. I get that.
You probably didn't as a House member.
Well, actually, I read every bill that I signed. I can't promise you that I understood every word. But as a governor, my goal will be to try to read all the bills. But I'm going to rely heavily on staff, as we all do, and as I'm sure the governor does. But there's a big difference in saying that a governor doesn't have to read every word of a bill, and a governor doesn't have to understand some of the major provisions in the bills that he signs and advocates. And there are several examples of that. The Vikings stadium bill is maybe the best one because there were multiple pieces of that, very fundamental pieces of that he expressed outrage about after he signed the bill, and he didn't just sign the bill, he at least claims that he negotiated the bill, but he didn't know what was in it, and he didn't know there was a farm equipment repair tax in the tax bill. That was a really big piece of the tax bill. It was a brand new tax. He criticized the Senate office building for being extravagant, but he signed the bill that funded the building. So there are a lot of examples of that, and I think being engaged, to me at least, means not just reading bills, but at least knowing what's in bills, and then also just being involved in some of the major issues that are facing the state rather than waiting until something becomes a crisis. And I'll give you a great example of that because we were up in Moorhead on Wednesday for our second debate, and there's a big water diversion project that is being hotly contested up there. It's largely led by the federal government, and it's been going on for quite a few years. The federal government wants to pump a lot of money into a water diversion project that mostly helps Fargo because Moorhead is much further along when it comes to protection, but also helps Moorhead some. And they're fighting about it because the plan right now has some farmers in Minnesota taking the brunt of the diversion of the water, and so they're not happy about it. And the governor has been pretty much AWOL on this thing for several years, and about 2-3 months ago, in an election year, he went up to Moorhead and the surrounding areas and had some town hall meetings and spoke very angrily about how horrible North Dakota has been treating us and threw some bricks at him and said, "You can't push me around." And then the next day decried the fact that we can't work together and get this done. If he had been involved all along, he should have been meeting with the governor of North Dakota and saying this is something we have to get done, but there are some Minnesota citizens who are going to be hurt the way you're doing it right now, so let's figure out how to make it happen. And we don't see that from this governor. And I can give you several other examples, but that's the one that just came up a couple days ago.
So that's kind of the engagement question and whether or not he's there. One of the specific pieces in this ad, is about the Viking Stadium, and it calls out the Wilfs specifically after they, quote, committed civil fraud and racketeering. Are you concerned about the Wilfs' ownership of the Vikings?
No, it's not about the Wilfs. This commercial and that message was about the governor, again, not being engaged or knowing what was going on. At least he claims that he negotiated the Vikings deal. And after the Vikings deal was inked and signed, and he signed it, the news came out, and people knew this news before, but it became headline news for whatever reason after the bill was signed, that the Wilfs were having some pretty serious legal problems. And the governor's response to that was, well, this is ridiculous. We need to do due diligence on this and make sure these guys deserve to have this deal. Well, you do due diligence before you sign a deal, not after. And I think that's a perfect example, again, of a governor. He claims that he negotiated the bill, but he apparently wasn't paying much attention to what was in it. So to me, it's not about the Wilfs. It's not even about the stadium, although I have my opinions on that. It's about the governor not being engaged and not really knowing what's going on.
Okay, you said it. You have opinions on the stadium. There are cranes all over Minneapolis. The Vikings are 2-3. Adrian Peterson's in deep water. What's your opinion on the stadium?
Well, I don't think it was a particularly good deal for the taxpayers of Minnesota. And you're not going to find a bigger Vikings fan than me or anyone else in my household, and we will be Vikings fans till the day we die.
You damn near named your kids after Vikings.
That's right. So if we have another 3-13 Les Steckel season, we will still be Vikings fans. But what concerns me, among other things, about this Viking stadium was that I think the governor felt like we have to get a deal no matter what. It doesn't matter what it looks like. Let's just get it done. And they got a deal. It wasn't a particularly good one, especially if you compare it to at least certain other deals around the country.
The other message that's in this ad that you've said even on this show this morning is competence. Are you seriously concerned or raising questions that maybe Governor Dayton isn't competent to be governor? And by competent, what do you think that means? And in your vision, or as you've watched him work, not specifics about examples, but you've engaged with him, you've talked to him, you've seen him in these debates. Is there a competency issue in your mind?
Yes, absolutely there is. I don't think he's competent to be governor. I don't think he has the capacity to handle such a big job. And this doesn't have, because I know the follow-up question is going to be, does this have something to do with his health? And to me, it has nothing to do with his health. I think it probably has more to do with his style. And it's not all that different to me than the question of engagement. I think competence is how involved are you? Do you understand what's going on? Are you able to think through an issue and really be involved enough in it to make sure that the outcome is what we want? And MNsure is probably the best example of the competence issue. Clearly, in my mind, the people that he appointed to run MNsure, both the board and the top staff, are not competent. And I think we can look at result after result after result. I think part of the governor's job, part of a measurement of the competence of a governor, is to make sure his staff is actually doing what they should be doing. And he doesn't seem to want to touch that issue.
You talk about style, but you also use the word capacity. Is it that he's not interested, he doesn't have the capacity to be interested, or, I don't want to dive into health because obviously that's a very touchy subject, but you and I have both been involved in organizations throughout time where somebody, doesn't have the capacity to do the job. Is it about his thoughts, his brain, his bandwidth? What do you think it is?
I don't know what it is, but I see it happening in example after example where, and maybe more of it is just the fact that he seems completely distant from the policy that's going on. I don't know if it's a disinterest on his part or otherwise, but I'm not sure how to put that into more specific words than it doesn't seem to me that he is up to such a big job.
Let's shift to economy and job climate. You raised it before. Republicans have harped for a long time about Minnesota's tax system. It's obviously front and center this year with Medtronic and some of the other issues, and obviously the taxes that have been increased and then cut. And but overall, throughout time, Minnesota has had a relatively strong economy. It may not peak like Silicon Valley, but it doesn't crash like Florida real estate. Where are the tweaks, or is there a full overhaul that needs to be made in our tax system?
I think there is a full overhaul that needs to be made, and you bring up an important point. We have, as a state, for decades, been able to weather recessions better than most other states, as we did this time. I think we came out of it, went through it, certainly with some problems and some issues, but less than a lot of other states. And part of that is because we have a history of a very strong business community, more Fortune 500 companies per capita than most other states, although that has changed. We've lost 4 in the last 3.5 years under Governor Dayton. But I think, particularly after what we've seen the last couple of years, we need to look at the entire tax structure. It's not about just saying, well, let's remove the new 4th tier that they just created and that solves the problem. Because I think before the tax increases of last year or 2 years ago, we needed a tax overhaul, and the governor actually agreed with that. If you remember right, during the campaign, he talked about taxing the rich, but after the campaign, after he was elected, he talked about the need for complete, comprehensive tax reform so that we are more competitive with other states, especially in this region. And he had his revenue commissioner traveling the state for 2 years, meeting with communities all over the state, saying, what changes do you think we need to make? Get ready. This is going to be big. We need you to buy in as stakeholders. And so everybody was waiting for some really significant reform. And then the governor got a gift that any governor would dream of, an all-DFL legislature, or a legislature all of your own party as governor. So you really could do something pretty significant if he wanted to. And the bill that he put out there, the reform in it was essentially huge tax increases. He broadened the sales tax, which I have always said we ought to be at least open to considering and looking at. So I give him credit for that. But then he created these business-to-business taxes that everybody on both sides of the aisle agreed were terrible policy, and a whole bunch of new taxes like the warehousing tax and the snowbird tax and the farm equipment sales tax, repair sales tax, and the list. It was a menu from the buffet of taxes that they just threw in there to increase revenue, not to reform the tax code. So that was, that in itself was such a disappointment. And then, of course, he got beaten up really heavily for a lot of those and pulled a bunch of them out, and then they reversed themselves on a minority of them the next year. But I think most people agree that it's not about tweaking. We really need to look around, especially around the Midwest, and see what other states that are succeeding are doing with respect to taxes. And we're never going to be South Dakota. That's just not who Minnesota is, and I completely understand that. We're not going to be a no-income tax state. But we've become so uncompetitive, and I'm sure you have, Blois, if you go to border communities, it is shocking what is happening to Moorhead versus Fargo, for example, or Wahpeton versus Breckenridge, or you can go all around the state and see how hurt our border communities are because businesses, especially small businesses, are either moving or starting across the border.
They can pick a side, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's easy for them to do that, yes.
So as we look at that, I've always said that, we need roads in Minnesota. We need schools. There are certain things here that are valuable. Is there a state that has done tax reform or has a tax system that we could model? Because I always say they have to pay for roads in Texas, too. Right. How do they do it? And I've been to Florida. There's a lot of congestion, but they have roads and things work there. The schools might not be very good, but is there a state that you think has really done this well and kind of evolved out of maybe old progressive tax systems to a new model?
There isn't any one particular state, and I'm not sure that any state has done it just right. And Minnesota will always do our own thing, as we should, because we are better than most other states. But I think what you do is, especially as you look around the Midwest and you see which states are thriving. and not just thriving with business creation, but are actually still providing the services to people that government needs to provide well. Indiana would probably be a pretty good example of that. I think Iowa is a pretty good example of where they've made some changes, and I think they're succeeding. North Dakota is an interesting example. They're doing better than almost any state in the country. Of course, they have a
natural resource.
Right. They have a special situation there. By the way, we have a natural resource, too, up in northern Minnesota that we're not at all taking advantage of in the copper and nickel mines up there. So we could be a little bit more like North Dakota that way, but that's a different issue. So, I would look around, and I'm not going to say, well, let's start with what Michigan has and go from there, or whatever other state. I will tell you, though, that there are a couple of Minnesota studies out there. I don't know if study is the right word, working group reports out there. The Vekich report that came out during the Pawlenty administration that had a lot of good ideas in it, not all of which I agree with, by the way, but a lot of good ideas in it, and that got shelved, because usually reports do. And there was a property tax working group report. Both of these were bipartisan groups that came out 2 or 3 years ago. So the first one was under the Pawlenty administration. This one was under the Dayton administration. That also had some good ideas in it that I think at least are starting points for us. And that report is also sitting on it, probably on the same shelf as the Pawlenty report is. And we had to pull them out and say, let's figure out of these things, what can both sides agree on? Because I'm going to have a DFL Senate for sure, and anything that I propose is going to have to be a bipartisan proposal if we actually want it to happen.
I want to talk about the Vekich report because you brought it up, and I look at this in my kind of following of Minnesota politics as kind of, you said there's some things in there you don't agree with, and I don't expect you to hash out the Vekich report, but I think in principle, there's something I want to bring up. So the governor appoints Mike Vekich, who's a really smart guy, to lead a commission to make some recommendations. And essentially, he's the governor's guy. And then the governor himself disagrees with the recommendations. As governor, do you approach that differently than Governor Pawlenty did? Or do you, because of the politics of maybe the tax increases that Vekich recommended, have to reject some of it? Or do you tell whoever you appoint to do that, look, come back to me with reform, but it can't have tax increases in it? How do you handle something like that? Because that always made me, smile, was that Pawlenty appointed this task force. He did the same thing on stadiums and then kind of rejected the task force's recommendations.
Yeah, well, I think one thing, at least I would do, is if I'm going to have a task force, I've been on task forces, so I know how...
I'm sorry.
I know. Well, it's horrible because you spend all this time, and oftentimes you know that all this really is just trying to put things off for a while, and nothing's going to happen with it. And I would say that most of my task force experiences have ended up that way. So I go into it recognizing that, and if there are really basic principles that I'm not going to be able to get past, or basic barriers that I'm not going to be able to get past, I will absolutely let them know right off the bat and tell them I'm not interested in increasing taxes overall. I mean, if we're going to increase one and cut one and make it revenue neutral, that's something that I would absolutely consider. But at least right now in Minnesota, we don't need overall higher tax burden. I happen to think it should be lower. And so if I have a task force or a group, they need to know that right off the bat, because I don't want something that I can't support. That's not the right starting point for negotiation. It at least has to be something that I can live with. And then there are always going to be pieces, because you don't appoint a task force if they're only going to do exactly what you want. Then I might as well just write the bill and move on. So there are always going to be pieces that I might not be comfortable with.
Yep.
But at least it's a starting point for then sitting down with the other people who you need to actually get something passed and say, all right, where do we go from here? What pieces of this can we all agree on, at least as our starting point, and then start hammering out the rest of the details.
Let's talk about roads. And I know you only have about 10 more minutes left. So as we talk about roads, Wednesday's debate in Moorhead, Governor Dayton came out and said, he supported a gas tax increase. He, quote, clarified his role yesterday. Roads is one of those issues, and transportation is one of those issues that comes up at the soccer field or the football field or the hockey rink because, you're usually scrambling to get there, and there's some kind of congestion, especially for that 5:30 game or 5:15 practice. What's your roads plan? How do we fast track it? Because even business says they don't support necessarily a gas tax increase this time, but we got to fix our transportation system because it's costing us money in commerce.
I don't believe that we need a gas tax increase. I don't believe we need to increase taxes, period. We had the biggest tax increase in state history a year and a half ago. And to argue that there's not enough money in there to fully fund our roads, I just think that I think the biggest problem we have in government, especially right now, is setting priorities. And to some people, like the governor, they roll their eyes and say, oh, that's too simplistic. But it isn't. When we go from a $30 billion biennial budget to almost a $40 billion biennial budget in 4 years, it doesn't suggest to me that we don't have enough money in the system. We've just got to be smarter about how we spend it. So that is first and foremost, we've got to prioritize those things that we can at least all agree are most important. And I think almost everybody would agree that roads and bridges, there are exceptions to this, but the vast majority of the decision makers will agree that roads and bridges are falling behind, and I will be chief among them. And if we actually start putting our transportation focus there, rather than where all the energy is right now. This is my life on the Hennepin County Board. It's light rail, it's commuter rail, it's high-speed rail, it's streetcars, it's trolleys, it's bike paths and sidewalks and complete streets, which is everything but the street, I've come to learn. It's exactly backwards, and the top priority has to be on roads and bridges because everybody relies upon that. Now, having said that, that is an important starting point. That's probably not going to get us there alone, especially in divided government. So we do have to actually find another source of funding. And I have long been a believer, even back when I was in the legislature, that more of our bonding bills should be dedicated to roads and bridges. Very, very little of our bonding bills are dedicated to that. We will probably require a constitutional change in order to do it in a big way, because right now you can't use GO bonds for state roads.
Yeah.
But you can for county and local roads. And so we could immediately be fed up considerably to take care of, probably half of the roads in the state. And then we'd have to seek a constitutional change in order to do that at the state highway level as well.
So you get the constitutional change. Let's say you lay all the groundwork for a big roads thing. Do you double down on bonding to get to, the $5 to $10 billion over the next 10 years that we're going to need?
Well, and I don't know if that number's right, boys. I've seen a bunch of different numbers, and a lot of the larger numbers include a lot more trains in there, and I just don't happen to believe that is the wisest use of taxpayer dollars. But we do need an increase. By doubling down, I don't think so, depending upon what you mean. I don't think we need to have a $2 billion versus a $1 billion bonding bill. I think we need to make tougher choices, though, and I know when I brought this up before, the governor said, well, you live in fantasy land because there's no way we can not fund all the other things that we have in the bonding bill. But there is. There absolutely is. Every family and every business in Minnesota has to make tough choices and can't fund some of the things they really want to fund but don't absolutely need. And I think we're at that point in government where we got to say, okay, we need to spend more, maybe a lot more, on our roads and bridges, and it means that some of the other things that we want but don't need are either going to have to be canceled or maybe put off for a while.
One thing on transit and rail is that, business has been supportive of rail. The Southwest line is supported by United Health and Twin West Chamber and some of those traditional business groups that Republicans really like to point to.
Yep.
What kind of conversation do you have with those groups if you're governor and they still want funding there?
I've had the conversation with them already multiple times, especially as a county commissioner, because we deal with a tremendous amount of transit on the county board. And I'm always open to listening, but my position on trains is show me the cost-benefit analysis for the taxpayer on these. And if there's a light rail for example, that has a reasonable cost-benefit analysis. In other words, it's going to actually relieve congestion in the metro in a way that is maybe comparable to the amount of money we're spending both to build it and to subsidize it every year. Mm-hmm. I'm all ears. I really am. I rode a train every day when I lived in Chicago. I haven't seen one of those reports yet that makes sense to me. It certainly doesn't make sense for Southwest when we're going to spend upwards of $2 billion to build it and somewhere between $20 and $30 million to subsidize it every year. And it's really going to do nothing to relieve congestion. It's about other things. That's my response to the business community is show me the cost-benefit analysis. That's the language they speak. And, they have probably other reasons for it than what I think we should be spending transportation dollars on. So they don't always love my answer to that. But as I said before, when it comes to schools, I'm not going to let the teachers' union dictate my policy. When it comes to transportation, I'm not going to let the business community do it either.
As we start to wrap up here, we're with Republican candidate for Governor Jeff Johnson. Thanks for spending some time with us today on issues, not just fun, lighthearted stuff. What is it that really drives you to want to be governor of the state of Minnesota?
This is going to sound really cheesy, and I'm not a real cheesy guy, but I, from my experience, both at the local level on the Kennebunk County Board and in the legislature, I believe that a strong leader can actually change the direction of the state in a positive way. I don't know that I believe that anymore at the federal level. I don't know how we fix the federal government. It's such a disaster. But I believe at the state level that things can happen, and they can happen quickly. And I think we've seen it in the last couple of years. I think it's gone in a negative way, but the state has changed its direction rather dramatically in a couple areas. And I think that comes from who's at the top and who they appoint as their commissioners, and also we've got all DFL legislature now too. So, when I look at the top three issues that I've been talking about all along, I believe I can go in there and actually make improvements to the K-12 education system and actually make our business climate better so that we are creating more good jobs rather than just low-paying jobs, and make government work better for people by auditing programs and measuring and making sure that the programs we're spending taxpayer dollars on actually are producing results.
Next Tuesday, you debate Governor Dayton and Hannah Nicolette again. How do you feel about Hannah Nicolette being in these debates? And then I'll save B for when you're done with that answer.
I'm fine either way. What we have said all along is whatever the organizers decide, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I get along great with Hannah, so I don't know. I don't know what the other three look like, but we are open to doing it either way.
And then second, yesterday after the governor made his kind of clarification on the gas tax, one of your supporters kind of took to Facebook and talked about frustration with the media that you are accused of, quote, going negative with the ad, and Governor Dayton gets away with just clarifying his position on the gas tax. How do you feel about media coverage of the race? Has it been fair and or adequate to really cover this race, or investigate either the positions you've taken of incompetence or lack of engagement from Governor Dayton?
Honestly, there's little interest on the media's part in questioning Governor Dayton about anything. That is a frustration. I don't talk about it much because, it's kind of just whining to most people. It is what it is. But I have press conferences, and they hammer me with questions, and I think in most cases they're good questions, really tough questions. And then I watch a press conference with the governor, and none of that ever happens. And that's frustrating, but it is the nature of who the media is largely right now, and I wish it were different, but it's not. So, I got to work harder to get my message out.
Sounds great. Jeff, thanks for joining the Daily Agenda today, and good luck down the road.
Thank you.
Yep.